Hello and welcome to my video series examining Missing 411 Eastern United States. We are at the Great Smoky Mountain chapter, which is actually quite lengthy compared to other sections. The case that started this journey for me, Dennis Martin, is in this chapter. Since I've already covered it, we will skip it this time. The chapter begins with some background information about the park in question, which I will read a little here, so please bear with me for a moment. The Great Smoky Mountains National Park straddles North Carolina and Tennessee. The park spans more than 500,000 acres, split fairly evenly between the two states. There were 9 million visitors in 2008, which was the highest number of visitors than any other park. 10 campgrounds accommodate 350,000 people annually. There are more than 2,000 miles of rivers, 300 miles of roads, 800 miles of trails, and the park employees number 250 for the permanent employees and 100 for seasonal workers. Some of the people in this chapter went missing in the park, but others were just close. Mr. Pilates highlights a perceived pattern in disappearances, that 2 or 3 males go missing, then 2 females. It's funny to me because the list he immediately shows after this claim doesn't bear this out. As you can see, the so-called pattern is only true once in the case list. As such, there is no pattern. Then he says that since 1951, there is an almost consistent 5 to 7 years between groups of people who went missing. Well, sure, a lot of cases fall between 5 and 7 years apart, but there's some that are 1 year apart, 4, or 14 years. What's his point? He then breaks down the days of the week when males and females went missing as if that matters at all. Sure, the majority of people went missing on a Friday, Saturday, or Sunday, but so? When do you think that most people go hiking or camping? On weekends. Further, he proceeded to leave out several of the cases that he himself covers in this section of the book, which completely throws off his, oh, only males go missing on Saturday and Sunday. Well, no. Only females go missing on Friday. Well, no. And not even mentioning the people who went missing on Tuesday. My point is that it's not just research into individual cases that are flawed in this book, especially given that there are more than 1,000 people reported missing in these mountains since 1934. Interesting that we're only looking at 16 of these cases. I'm sure that the argument is, well, only those 16 fit the missing 411 criteria. As I have shown time and time again, the cases in this book don't even always meet those same criteria. Speaking of that, let's get on to cases presented in the book. Michael Auberry. Michael, who was 12 years old at the time, went missing on March 17, 2007 from Doughton Park, North Carolina. The park contains many old settlements from pioneers and is known for trout fishing. The park is approximately 100 miles northeast of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, but in the same mountain range. Michael was camping with his Boy Scout troop. He ate lunch with his fellow scouts, but at 1 p.m., he was missing. A search was launched before nightfall. His mess kit was found 1 mile from his camp. Heavy rain hit the search area, which hampered searches. A FLIR-equipped helicopter was deployed, but could not find him. FLIR, by the way, is something that will detect infrared and is commonly used by police helicopters. The FBI turned up unannounced and declared that they'd be monitoring the search, which is very unusual. Pilates thinks that the FBI are, quote, quietly monitoring disappearances in the Great Smoky Mountains area, close quote. Law enforcement was issued a, quote, area-wide missing person alert as a precaution should the boy have gotten outside of the search area, close quote, because, quote, someone somewhere had concerns that weren't expressed to the press. close quote. Those quotes being from Missing 411. 3 days later, on the 20th, Michael was found alive but disoriented near a creek. To completely understand what happened to Michael, he may need to go through hypnosis. Let's review. There's not a lot wrong with the first part, but let's look at the second part. There are some serious omissions here that would hurt the Missing 411 narrative if they were known. You see, Michael was found by a search dog. That's right, a dog led searchers directly to him. It's also made clear in articles that while he was disoriented, dehydrated, and generally not well, he did tell people that he remembered searching for his troop and sleeping under tree branches and rocks. No hypnosis required. The reason why there are reports of police not knowing much is because they actively chose not to ask very much at the time due to his condition. Then let's talk about the FBI involvement. The FBI took the same stance in other cases that we've covered, such as the Dennis Martin case. That is, that they were present, monitoring, but not actively investigating. They investigate kidnappings of missing children, so it makes sense that they were there, as a kidnapping was a possibility. In addition, if they are secretly monitoring the disappearances in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, then what are they doing 100 miles away in North Carolina? Further, I imagine that the area-wide alert, which I can't find any articles referencing, was issued for this contingency. That is the contingency that he was kidnapped. Why is this strange? Let's move on. Bonnie Lee Edwards. Bonnie, who was 9 years old at the time, went missing on January 9th, 1965, from Pilot Mountain, North Carolina. Bonnie's family lived on a farm surrounded by wooded areas near the mountain. She was mentally handicapped and had the relative intellect of a 6-year-old. She was last seen by the neighbors' children as she played with them. She told them that she was getting tired and going home, but she had never made it there. A search was launched by 4:30 p.m. that day and continued with more than 1,000 searchers, including helicopters. The next day, a local farmer found Bonnie's body curled up in a brush pile within view of her residence. The coroner, a dentist, determined that she had died from exposure early that morning. Pilates said that it's impossible that the searchers had missed her when she was so close to home. Pilates also says that the county didn't have a medical examiner and only this coroner. So no autopsy was performed and we will never know what really happened. Let's review. I like how up until this point, coroners not being medical examiners hasn't been an issue in any other case. Let me read from the book. Quote, "Wow, the coroner was a dentist? It appears as though there was not a medical examiner to check the condition of Bonnie. That was unfortunate." Close quote. Pilates even complains that the coroner, Dr. Carl Thomas, was a dentist. You know, a medical professional. Besides this, which on its own perhaps might be a valid complaint, a physician, Dr. Henry Newsom, was the one who pronounced the cause of death as exposure. An autopsy was not necessary. That's why there wasn't one done, not because of the lack of a medical examiner. Do you know how I know that for certain? Because coroners can do autopsies no matter what their professional occupation is. The only time that autopsies are done is when a regular exam cannot determine the cause of death. But here Pilates is, complaining that this 9-year-old child wasn't cut up on a table to confirm the physician's diagnosis. I'd also like to point out that considering that Pilates had a previous career in law enforcement, he should be well aware that coroners have the ability to conduct autopsies. All of that aside, there are still some facts that are also incorrect. She never said that she was tired and was going home. Bonnie's playdate with the other children was broken up by a rainstorm that hit the area. I saw that she was either a mile or a quarter mile away from her home, not just within view, but that's nitpicking for sure, and not even the biggest problem. The thing that is glossed over, and it just blows my mind, the part where Pilates says that it's impossible that Searchers missed her is so deceitful. It is possible that Searchers missed her. First of all, they did, so obviously it's possible. And secondly, all of the searches up until the point where she was found had taken place either in the rain or at night. This was the very first search that took place in the daylight. Let's move on. Trenny Lynn Gibson. This is the first case where Pilates seems to remember what section of the book he's supposed to be on, as Trenny, who was 16 years old at the time, went missing on October 8th, 1976, from the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. Trenny was on a high school trip at the time. She was bouncing between different groups, so it wasn't immediately noticed when she went missing. The area is very rugged except for the trail. That night, rains and winds swept through the area with temperatures in the low 30s. A witness saw Trenny bend down as if looking for something, then she stepped off the trail. Subsequent witnesses backed this up, though the area off the trail was very unhospitable. The FBI joined the investigation as passive observers on the 13th. The search was later called off, but she was never found. On April 7th, 1977, her father asked the search to resume, but the park superintendent would only allow 25 searchers to continue, despite a high number of volunteers. In the case summary, which we all know by now isn't a summary, this statement is made. Quote, "There is no possible way that a 16-year-old girl left the trail voluntarily at that point to hike cross-country. No way." Close quote. Good to know that Pilates is an expert on 16-year-old girls. Let's review. There is one point that is incorrect, and another that requires a little bit more context. The FBI in this instance were not passive. They weren't just monitoring. And looking into this, we also get a little bit more context on FBI involvement in these cases in general, and why they always seem to show up. National parks are federal reserves, which means that any crime committed there would be under FBI jurisdiction. As such, they investigated possible suspects of foul play or kidnapping. They were also the ones who interviewed all of her friends. I find it very difficult to believe that Pilates does not know that the FBI had an active role and were the ones doing the interviews, since he cites those interviews several times, though never indicates who was giving those interviews. As for the search being ended and only allowing a certain number of people to continue, even though there were a high volume of volunteers, keep in mind that this is also a nature preserve, and that hundreds or thousands of people tromping through off of the trails would be extremely detrimental to the ecosystem there. And I realize that, hey, we're talking about the life of a young woman who went missing there, and so surely any damage incurred on the park, would pale in comparison to the prospect of being able to find her. I think that clearly the park superintendent at least disagreed with that sentiment, whether he believes that Trenny just was abducted and is no longer there, or she's already beyond help. So having hundreds of people trouncing around in the woods would not be any more effective than allowing a smaller number of more trained individuals search. In either case, that search ended in May of 1977, and she is indeed still missing. Geoffrey Burns Hague is up next. Geoffrey, who was 16 years old at the time, went missing on February 8th, 1970 from the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. He was with his Boy Scout troop at the time. It was already snowy and had 6 inches of snow on the ground. They had camped in the park, then continued hiking the next day. By 9:30 a.m., they noticed that Geoffrey was lagging behind the group. When the troop arrived at the next trailhead, Geoffrey told the troop leader that he was going to wait for another scout that was further behind the group and follow along with him. When the last scout arrived at the meeting point at the end of the trail and hadn't seen Geoffrey, however, his entire troop went back to the camp in search of him and reported him missing. The trail was clearly marked, so they were confused as to how he could get lost. The weather deteriorated fast and temperatures fell. On the 16th, Geoffrey's pack was found on a large rock in the middle of a river about a mile downstream of the trail. Items were laid out as if he was taking stock of what he had. It was at first believed, due to his scent trail, that he had made it to a highway and was taken by a motorist. Geoffrey's body was found on February 18th, about 1,000 yards below the trail, about a mile away from where he was last seen. He was in this state of partial undress and slumped under a tree, as if he was in the middle of removing his clothing. A medical examiner determined that he had died the first day he had gone missing from exposure. Let's review. There's a lengthy theory spinning session after this case, mostly concerning Paulides being confused about paradoxical undressing. I'll just skip that for reviewing the facts. They did indeed camp in the park. At that time, Geoffrey was reprimanded by a scout leader because he got into a snowball fight. That definitely caused some friction between himself and the scout leader. The articles that I saw at the time didn't say that he was going to wait for a scout that was behind everybody else. Rather, he sat down on the trail and just said, "Hey, go on, I'll catch up." They were, however, not confused as to why he had left the clearly marked trail after they realized he was missing, because they were convinced that he had purposely left the trail, as he was noted in nearly every article that I read, that he was obsessed with a survival show, and had in fact argued with the scout leader about this show the night before. The initial belief, as I mentioned earlier, that he was abducted on the highway was due to search dogs following the scent there. When they realized that, hey, it's because the river has carried the scent downstream in this direction, the search dogs were able to then lead searchers directly to his body. I have seen tons of variants in the articles about the distance between the trail and where he was found, and all of these different key points. So it's hard to say for the distances given, so we'll just accept what's in the book. As for his final resting place, however, it is perfectly explained in this case. The coroner stated that Geoffrey had tried to climb the steep incline and had tumbled 20 feet back down again and landed against the small tree where he was later found. As I stated before, nearly every article that I read reports the same thing. Geoffrey made the decision to go off the trail on his own due to 2 things: a recent obsession with the survival show and friction with the scout leader. He decided to go into a dangerous drainage area, realized that that was a bad idea, tried to climb back out, fell, and froze to death. His camping equipment being on the rock in the middle of the stream is strange, I'll give you that, but there was speculation that he was trying to set up camp near the site, something that Paulides leaves out. Along with forgetting to mention that almost every article reports that he chose to go missing due to his fascination with the survival show. So I don't have an answer for why the pack was in the middle of the creek, unless the creek had frozen over, in which case the creek would have appeared more as a clearing. But considering the earlier statements about the scent being carried by the river, it's really tough to say. In any case, let's go ahead and move on. Mark Hanson. Mark, who was 21 years old at the time, went missing on March 7th, 1975 from the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. At the time, Mark was hiking with his friends from college, Ben and John. The weather was snowy, wet, and cold. Partway down the trail, John bowed out and headed back to the car due to the weather. Further on, Mark ditched his pack on the trail. He told Ben that he didn't think that he could make it to the shelter that was further up the road with the added weight. Hours later, at 8:30 p.m., it was pitch dark and the weather was only getting worse. Mark told Ben that he couldn't go on and he collapsed in the middle of the trail. Ben tried to get Mark to continue, but Mark didn't respond. Ben continued on his own for 200 yards before he too called it quits and lay down in the middle of the road. Ben didn't know it at the time, but he was just 200 yards from the shelter. As he slept, Ben had a dream of Mark calling to him for help, and he thought as he woke up that maybe he actually heard it, but he doesn't know for sure. The next morning, Ben couldn't find Mark. He found other hikers at the shelter and he enlisted their help. The NPS was contacted for help officially on the 10th. Mark's pack was found untouched. On the afternoon of March 17th, Mark's body was found 2 miles down the creek from the Appalachian Trail. His body was leaning up against a tree, his parka was open, and his boots and gloves were in the snow nearby. The coroner concluded that Mark had died 24 to 36 hours after he was last seen. Paulides says that there could be no mistaking the trail, even in darkness. Paulides goes on to draw a false parallel to Geoffrey here, as they were both downhill near a creek and could not be seen from the air. To which I say, so, what does that prove? He says it all ominously, like it means something. But the common consensus is that Mark awoke alone on the trail with no supplies and in complete darkness. I don't care how well something is marked, if you can't see it, you'll miss it. That's like saying, hey, the trail was clearly marked, so you should be able to navigate it with your eyes closed. That simply isn't true. The belief is that he decided to go downhill to seek relief from the cold, because he didn't know how far away the shelter was, nor did he think that he could make it all the way back to his supplies in the dark. I know that explaining possible motivation and theories doesn't mark a discrepancy in the book's facts, so let's review the facts. Immediately we've hit our first discrepancy. Mark went missing on March 9th. March 7th appears the day that they set off on the hike, but they had apparently already gone partway and camped for a night, which immediately leads into the next point of John bowing out and supposedly going back to his car. As they were already a day into the hike, he didn't go back to his car, he went back to a nearby ranger station. And further, it wasn't due to the bad weather, it's because his boots didn't fit him quite right. As for Mark ditching his pack, I have seen this reported many ways. First, I've seen that Mark dropped his pack as described. Second, I've seen that Mark didn't drop the pack, but Ben found it abandoned when he returned to where Mark was. And third, I've seen it reported that Ben took the pack from Mark to carry it for him, but later he ditched it on the path. I didn't see any references to this idea that Ben was only 200 yards away from the shelter when he stopped. I mean, I read a lot of articles and not one of them mentioned 200 yards. It doesn't really matter because either way he didn't make it there. let's talk about this dream thing that Ben is reported to have. Prior to reading this in Missing 411, I've heard this story before, and I think it was on YouTube. I can't remember where, but I think I've heard it a few times, and in every retelling that I've heard this part about Ben having this dream where Mark is calling to him for help. I have not been able to find a single source for this idea outside of Missing 411, but it is so prevalent that it really makes me think that there has to be a source somewhere and I'm just missing it. So if you know the original source, or just a source that doesn't reference Missing 411 but is an original article, please let me know. I'd love to see it. As for Ben going back and checking on Mark, realizing he's gone, freaking out, and then going and getting hikers to go and look, it happened the other way around. When Ben woke up the next day, he hiked the rest of the way to the rest stop first, because that was the plan. Once he hiked the rest stop, the shelter, there were other hikers there, and he said, "Hey, can you come and help me and get my friend and his pack?" And then from there, they came back to retrieve Mark. It doesn't seem like a huge difference, but then you realize that we don't know when he went missing. I've already mentioned that it doesn't matter how well the trail was marked. Your eyes need light. It's so mind-blowing that Paulides would even make a statement like that. Although I only cite 2 sources for this, know that I read upwards of 30 news articles, and that's generally the case. I'll pick 2 that have the most complete story, and I will cite them in these videos, but typically I read many more, 10 times more sources than I cite. And that's not by virtue of like saying like, oh, you're cherry picking. This is a virtue of how newspapers work. When a newspaper picks up an article, that story is often sold to other newspapers, or at least that's how it appears. Maybe they're just plagiarized, but I've seen many times, even in this particular case, where a story appears exactly the same in 2 newspapers word for word, and I'm like, hey, what's going on here? Until I see that the article, the author for the article is cited to be the same person, even though they're 2 different publications. But like I said, just know that there's a lot more than just 2 sources for this and most other cases. I also just lastly want to address this last statement by Paulides. If he was fit enough to walk for 2 miles to his destination, then he would have been fit enough to crawl the trail. But remember, he was too weak to hike 3 miles in the middle of the night when he had just passed out on the trail of exhaustion. So Paulides is saying, hey, he collapsed on the trail and he couldn't go any further. How would he have made it, 3 miles away? Well, that's kind of misleading. First, I don't see any mention of how far he was from the shelter, but it doesn't matter how far he was from the shelter because Mark didn't know how far he was from the shelter. So Mark traveled downhill for 3 miles. We don't know the time frame from when he did this, because unlike how Paulides reports it, Ben didn't go back to check on Mark right away. He pressed onwards to get help. Mark was able to travel 3 miles because perhaps he got some rest. We don't know when he left. Or maybe because he was going downhill. In any case, I feel as though I've harped on this enough. Minnie, Haun. We are leaving the Great Smoky Mountains National Park for this case. Minnie, who was 3 years old at the time, went missing on October 8th, 1957 from Wells Springs, Tennessee. Minnie's mother took her and her siblings out walnut hunting in the woods behind their home. She left Minnie with her 4-year-old sister alone for a time, telling them to stay put. Minnie didn't listen, and she told her sister that she was going to walk home while her sister stayed where she was. When her mother returned, she realized what had happened. They checked at home to see if Minnie had made it, and they called the sheriff. Within hours, there was dozens of people searching for her, and within 24 hours, there were thousands. 52 hours into searching, the sheriff called off the searchers, and Minnie's father was forced to search with only the aid of volunteers. Bits of Minnie's clothing were found 6 miles from her house. Her shoe and sock, then her cap. Daily Middleborough News from October 15th, 1957 reported that, quote, "A mile and a half of rough underbrush and wooded mountain land from where her tracks were located," close quote, "they found her body on a ridgeline." Some reports say that she was at the base of a cliff, but this is untrue. She was on the ridgeline without her shoes or hat. The Kingsport Times, on the same day, reported that she had climbed many cliffs. Pilates wraps up this case by making these claims about the FBI. The FBI was called, which only happens if there's a crime. The FBI closed the case as soon as the body was found, and the FBI destroyed the records of this case in 1999. Then, he paradoxically makes a conclusion that Minnie must have been abducted since the FBI was involved. Does he not realize that he's contradicting himself? The FBI were involved because, as Pilates himself states, the sheriff called them requesting help. They closed the case when her body was found because, as he states, the only thing that they're interested in investigating is if there's an abduction or crime involved. There wasn't, so they closed the case. But let's look at the facts. There are 2 reports of what she told her sister. One, that she was going home, as in missing 411, and the other report was that she said that she was going over there for a while. The very common step of going to a neighbor's house and searching with them is left out, but that's pretty common. As for the dozens and thousands of people searching for her, we get a rather interesting insight from a dog handler. Quote, "Too many people had been beating over and over the same ground for the dogs to pick up a trail," Williams explained. Close quote. This dog handler was explaining why her animals were having a very difficult time tracking Minnie. And as that quote explains, there were too many people and it was destroying the scent. So I wonder if that can damage the scent line, then it may explain other big cases where thousands of people are involved and the dogs can't pick up a trail. Because of the huge response, it actually makes it more difficult to find the missing person. I did see a report on the 12th that corroborates the idea that the sheriff called off the search, but it's obviously untrue. That's because later newspapers note that the sheriff was in charge of the search the whole time and further was present when her body was found. He was even publicly praised for his work. It's a very odd pattern of Pilates, a former officer, trying to throw other law enforcement officers under the bus every single chance he gets. I couldn't find the paper that he cites specifically, but other articles noted that nearby her body and her socks were stuffed inside of her shoes as if she was preparing for bed. As for her being found on a ridgeline as opposed to the base of a cliff and one of those being false, they're actually both true. She was indeed high up on a mountain and on a ridgeline, but she was also at the base of a cliff. Her overalls, which her dress had been stuffed into, was lying at the top of a sheer cliff 20 feet above her body, something else that Pilates leaves out. A jury found that she had died from exposure, starvation, or perhaps a fall from the cliff. Even in one of the articles that Pilates cites, it notes that she fell off a cliff. This is another case where the oddities and mystery don't need enhancement through omissions or fabrications, which, of course, I'm not saying happened here on purpose, and is surely just the result of sloppy research. Michael Edwin Huron. Michael, who was 51 at the time, went missing on August 23, 2008, from Happy Valley, Tennessee. Michael had made plans to mow his parents' property on the day that he went missing. When he failed to show up, his parents came to check on him. They found his car in a driveway, the lawnmower on the trailer, and his wallet, keys, cell phone, and gun on the counter inside of his house. An ATV was missing from the garage. They waited for a day, then called his brothers. He then contacted law enforcement. His ATV was found 1 mile from his residence, near Adams Creek. The ignition was turned on, but the engine was turned off via the kill switch, something his family said he wouldn't normally do. The location where he was found is a 1/4 mile from the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. Heavy rains hit the area, which hampered the search. These next points are likely unverifiable, since they were allegedly gathered between an interview via Pilates and another investigator and Michael's neighbors in 2011. Michael's ATV was in the driveway of a residence in a rural area behind the creek, near a residence that he was supposed to be watching for a friend. Pilates remarks that he believes that Michael heard or saw something, that he went to investigate, and something happened to him. He goes on to expound that he was removed from his ATV suddenly, and whatever took him was, quote, quick, strong, and determined, close quote. I'm going to call that an obvious Bigfoot illusion, and for those of you who will argue that he's referring to a human attacker, he refers to the attacker as being a what twice, and never a who. He also says that he was floored by both this person and Dennis Martin's parents having the same unusual door knocker. Yes, door knocker. Because two people having the same door knocker that is available online is strange and somehow is related to disappearances. Is he saying that this door knocker is cursed? Is he saying that someone is hunting humans and uses this door knocker as a way to choose victims? Very bizarre. But let's review. Honestly, the things that I found here are mostly correct. There's one semi-correction I can make, and honestly I'm not 100% sure on it, so I'm going to give it to Missing 411. But from what I was able to find, the property that he was on that he was supposed to mow was a family property that primarily he took care of, and not necessarily a property belonging to his parents that he was supposed to go and mow for them. Since I, again, can't confirm or dispute the information in the private interview, and leaving the wild theories aside, what is reported is pretty correct. It's a very strange case, and I encourage you to look into it yourself. It's odd, and something definitely happened to him. I mean, I don't think Bigfoot did it, but definitely something unusual happened. This video is getting quite long, so I've decided to split the Great Smoky Mountains National Park section in 2 parts. This will be resumed in part 2. Thank you very much for watching, and until next time, take care.